I never thought it would come to this. When I first opened my heart to them, it was with nothing but good intentions. It was pure, unfiltered kindness, a belief that by offering a helping hand or a shoulder to lean on, I was making their lives a little easier, a little brighter. I've always been someone who values empathy, someone who believes in seeing the best in others. Maybe that's where it all started. My need to be the kind of person who understood the pain of others because I, too, had known what it felt like to hurt. I believed that kindness was a language everyone understood. It was a universal connector, right? If I could show them compassion, offer my time and my heart, they would see that I was sincere. They would know that they could count on me. And so, I dove in. I became the one they turned to when things got tough, when the weight of the world seemed too much to carry. I listened to their fears, their frustrations, their dreams, and their sorrows. I made space for them in my life, and it felt good to know that I could be there, to make a difference in someone's world. But somewhere along the way, things began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a missed thank you here, a dismissive comment there. It was nothing too serious, or at least that's what I told myself. Maybe they were stressed, overwhelmed, caught up in their own struggles. I didn't mind at first because in my mind, helping someone wasn't supposed to be about recognition or appreciation. It was about doing the right thing. It was about being there when others needed you most, no matter the cost. But the more I gave, the less I seemed to matter. I began to notice that my kindness wasn't always met with kindness in return. Instead of gratitude, there was expectation. The little favors I did out of the goodness of my heart became routine for them, a new standard I was somehow supposed to uphold. They stopped asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, and I, in my endless desire to be the good person, to never let anyone down, kept giving. I convinced myself that this was just what kindness looked like, that maybe I needed to give even more to finally be seen and appreciated. But deep down, I was starting to feel the cracks in the foundation of this relationship. As the days passed, the weight of those unspoken expectations became harder to bear. I found myself doing more and more for them, without question, without hesitation. But each time I offered my help, it felt less like an act of kindness and more like an obligation. The joy that had once come from giving began to disappear, replaced by a growing sense of resentment and frustration. I still wanted to believe that they saw me, that they appreciated the efforts I was putting in, but their actions told me otherwise. It was as if I had become invisible, my feelings and my needs irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. I started to feel trapped in a cycle of giving and receiving nothing in return. Every time I offered my support, I hoped that this time they would notice how much I was sacrificing for them. I hoped that they would reach out and ask how I was doing, how I was feeling, if I needed anything. But that moment never came. Instead, their requests for my time and energy only grew, and I was left wondering if I had made a mistake by caring too much, by giving too much. The first signs that something was wrong crept in slowly, like a whisper I could barely hear. It wasn't one big moment, but rather a series of small, almost unnoticeable incidents that, over time, began to weigh heavily on my heart. It was the dismissiveness in their tone when I needed to talk. The way they brushed off my concerns with a half-hearted, "Oh, you'll be fine," while expecting me to drop everything when they needed a shoulder to cry on. It was the little promises they broke, the plans they cancelled without so much as an apology, as if my time and effort were disposable, as if I were disposable. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself that maybe I was overthinking it, that maybe they were just having a bad day, a bad week, a bad month. I told myself that this wasn't about me, that I was simply there to support them through their struggles, and that once things settled down, they would remember all the times I had been there for them. They would realize how much I had done, how much I had sacrificed, and they would start giving back in the same way. But the more I waited for that moment, the more I began to doubt it would ever come. The cracks in the foundation deepened with every new instance of their indifference. I started to notice that the only time they reached out to me was when they needed something. Advice, a favor, a solution to a problem. They never called just to check in, never asked how I was doing unless it was in passing, a formality they barely acknowledged before shifting the conversation back to themselves. I began to feel like I was no longer a person in their eyes, but rather a tool, something they could use whenever it was convenient for them. And yet, despite the growing pain in my heart, I continued to give. I convinced myself that maybe, if I gave a little more, if I showed them just how much I cared, things would change. They had to, right? But nothing changed. Each act of kindness I extended felt like it disappeared into a void, unacknowledged, unreciprocated. The more I gave, the more I felt hollow inside, as though I was pouring out pieces of myself and receiving nothing in return. It wasn't just that they didn't appreciate what I was doing. It was that they didn't even seem to see me anymore. I was a means to an end, a source of comfort and convenience when they needed it, and nothing more. And as that realization sank in, the pain became almost unbearable. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that I was strong enough to keep giving, even if it hurt. But the truth was, I was starting to break. I could feel it every time they asked for something else, every time they disregarded my feelings, every time they took what I offered without so much as a thank you. The cracks in my heart were no longer small. They were growing wider with every passing day, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that I was okay. Eventually, I hit a breaking point. There came a day when I couldn't pretend anymore, when the weight of everything I'd given without receiving anything in return became too much to bear. I was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, even physically. I had nothing left to give, and yet they still asked for more. I remember the moment clearly, the way my heart sank as they made another demand, completely unaware or unconcerned with how much I was struggling. I realized then that they didn't care about me, not in the way I had hoped. They cared about what I could do for them, and as long as I continued to give, they would continue to take. It was in that moment that I finally understood. I had been sacrificing myself for people who didn't see me, who didn't value me. My kindness had been twisted into something else, something painful, something that was slowly destroying me from the inside out. And I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep giving pieces of myself to people who didn't care enough to protect them. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but I knew that if I didn't stop, I would lose myself completely. So, I walked away. I walked away from the people who had taken my kindness for granted, who had used me until there was nothing left to use, And though it hurt, though the pain of their betrayal cut deep, I knew that it was the right thing to do. There came a moment when I had nothing left to give. I can't pinpoint the exact day or hour it happened, but I remember the crushing exhaustion that swept over me, like a wave I couldn't outrun. It was a culmination of countless instances where I had extended myself far beyond what was reasonable, far beyond what I could bear, and had received nothing in return but indifference. I had stretched myself so thin, catering to their needs, that I could barely recognize the person I had become. I was no longer someone who gave freely from a place of love and generosity. I had become someone who gave because I was expected to, because they demanded it, and I didn't know how to say no. I remember the day it all came crashing down. It was one of those ordinary days that you don't expect to turn into anything significant. The kind of day that feels like just another in a long series of monotonous routines. But something was different that day. Something in me had finally broken. I was tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. The constant giving, the constant bending over backward to be everything for them, had drained me of all my strength. And yet, even as I stood there on the edge of my own personal collapse, they didn't notice. They didn't see the dark circles under my eyes from nights spent worrying about their problems, or the way my hands shook from the anxiety of trying to juggle their needs with my own life. They didn't care. That day, they asked for more. It wasn't an unusual request. In fact, it was something small, something they would have considered trivial. But for me, it was the final straw. It was like they had reached into my chest and pulled out the last shred of energy, of compassion, that I had been clinging to. I stood there, listening to their request, feeling a kind of numbness settle over me. I had no more fight left in me, no more capacity to give them what they wanted. And still, they asked for more, completely oblivious to the fact that I was barely holding myself together. I don't remember exactly what I said in that moment. Maybe I didn't say anything at all. Maybe the silence between us was enough to communicate the deep sense of betrayal I felt. The overwhelming realization that they had never truly seen me as a person. To them, I had been a convenience, a resource, someone who existed only to fulfill their needs. And now, as I stood there, empty and broken, they couldn't even see the wreckage they had caused. For so long, I had believed that my worth was tied to what I could offer others. I had convinced myself that being kind meant always putting others first, always sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of someone else's comfort. But in that moment, as I stared at the person who had taken so much from me without ever giving anything back, I realized how wrong I had been. Kindness is not a one-way street. It is not something that should be demanded or expected. It is something that should be cherished and reciprocated. And yet, I had allowed myself to be used, to be drained, all in the name of being kind. The pain I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just the pain of being taken for granted, though that was certainly part of it. It was the pain of realizing that I had lost myself in the process. I had given so much of myself away that there was barely anything left. I had become a shell of the person I once was. Someone who existed only to serve the needs of others, without ever stopping to ask what I needed in return. I think what hurt the most was the realization that they didn't even understand the gravity of what they had done. To them, my pain was invisible, irrelevant. They didn't see how much I had struggled, how many nights I had spent crying over the feeling of being used, how many times I had told myself that things would get better, that they would eventually see how much I was hurting and start to care. But they never did. They never asked how I was feeling, never noticed the toll their constant demands were taking on me. I was nothing more than a background figure in their life, someone they could call on when things got tough, but never someone they truly valued. It was in that moment, standing there on the precipice of my own emotional collapse, that I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for people who didn't care about me, who didn't see me. I couldn't keep giving and giving until there was nothing left of me. I had to stop. I had to protect myself, even if it meant walking away from people I had once cared about deeply. But walking away was easier said than done. It wasn't just about physically removing myself from their lives. It was about untangling the emotional bonds that had kept me tied to them for so long. It was about letting go of the guilt that came with setting boundaries. The fear that I would be seen as selfish or uncaring for finally saying no. For so long, I had been conditioned to believe that my value came from how much I could give to others. That my worth was defined by how selfless I could be. And now, as I stood on the edge of cutting those ties, I was terrified. I was terrified of what it would mean to walk away. Would they hate me for it? Would they talk about me behind my back, calling me ungrateful or accusing me of abandoning them? And more importantly, would I be able to live with myself for putting my own needs first? For so long, I had ignored my own desires, my own well-being, in favor of keeping others happy. The thought of finally prioritizing myself felt foreign, almost wrong. But I knew deep down that I couldn't continue the way I had been. If I didn't put an end to it, I would lose myself entirely. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. Every part of me wanted to reach out to them, to explain why I couldn't keep doing this, why I had to take a step back, but I knew that no explanation would make a difference. They wouldn't understand. They had never understood. So I made the decision to walk away without a word. Without any grand farewell or emotional confrontation, I simply disappeared from their lives, hoping that in my absence, they would at least realize what they had lost. But even if they didn't, I knew that I had done the right thing for me. The pain of walking away was sharp, like a knife cutting through my heart. I had invested so much of myself into these people, these relationships, and now I had to let it all go. It wasn't just the loss of them that hurt. It was the loss of the person I'd been when I was with them. I had to mourn the version of myself that had tried so hard to be everything for everyone, even though that version of me had been slowly destroying herself in the process. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, something unexpected happened. Slowly I began to feel lighter. The weight that had pressed down on me for so long, the constant demands and expectations began to lift. I had room to breathe again, to think about what I wanted, what I needed. I had space to rediscover myself, to figure out who I was without the burden of always having to be the caregiver, the problem solver, the one who was always there. Walking away hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and though the pain of it still lingered, I knew that in time, it would fade. What would remain, however, was the lesson I had learned, one that had come at a great cost, but one that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Kindness is not about giving until you have nothing left. It is about balance, about knowing when to give and when to protect yourself. And most importantly, it is about understanding that you, too, are deserving of the same kindness you so freely offer to others. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done. It wasn't just about physically leaving the situation, removing myself from the people who had taken my kindness for granted. It was about untangling the emotional web that had kept me bound to them for so long. Every fiber of my being resisted the act of letting go. I had invested so much of myself in them, so much time, energy, and love, that walking away felt like ripping a part of myself out of place. It hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. But deep down, I knew it was the only way I could begin to heal. For days, I questioned myself, doubted the decision I had made. A part of me feared I was being too harsh, too selfish. The guilt was overwhelming at times, gnawing at me in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. It felt strange, almost unnatural, to put myself first after so many years of prioritizing everyone else. I had built my identity around being the person who was always there for others, always available, always ready to give. And now, as I stood in the silence of my newfound solitude, I wondered who I was without that role. But as the days stretched into weeks, something inside me began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I started to feel lighter. The constant weight that had hung over me for so long, the demands, the expectations, the unspoken pressures, began to lift. I hadn't realized just how heavy it had been until it was gone. It was as if I had been carrying an invisible burden for years. And now, for the first time, I was learning how to stand without it. At first, the freedom felt strange, like stepping into a new world I didn't quite recognize. I had been so consumed with meeting the needs of others that I hadn't taken the time to understand my own needs, my own desires. Now, with the space and distance I had created, I found myself asking questions I hadn't asked in years. What do I want? What makes me happy? What brings me joy? Not as a result of making someone else happy, but simply for myself. The answers didn't come right away. In fact, it took time for me to even feel comfortable asking those questions. For so long, I had equated kindness with self-sacrifice. I believed that in order to be kind, I had to put everyone else before myself, even if it meant neglecting my own well-being. But the more I reflected on it, the more I realized how flawed that thinking was. Kindness wasn't about erasing myself for the sake of others. It wasn't about giving until I had nothing left. True kindness, I began to see, included being kind to myself. That realization didn't come easily. It took countless moments of doubt, of wrestling with the guilt that came from setting boundaries, from saying no. It was a process of unlearning, of dismantling the deeply ingrained belief that I was only valuable if I was giving something to others. But with each passing day, I grew stronger in my conviction. I began to see that setting boundaries wasn't an act of selfishness. It was an act of self-preservation. It was a way to protect the parts of myself that had been worn down and depleted for so long. As I began to reclaim those parts of myself, I noticed something unexpected. The world didn't fall apart because I said no. The people who truly cared about me, the ones who valued me for more than just what I could give, respected my boundaries. They understood that my kindness didn't come with an obligation to give endlessly, and the ones who couldn't accept that, they faded away, disappearing like shadows in the sunlight. It was painful to lose those connections, but I came to understand that their absence was a blessing in disguise. They had only been in my life to take, to drain, and I no longer had room for that. In the space that was left behind, I found something beautiful, clarity. I began to see the world and myself in a new light, without the constant noise of other people's needs drowning out my own. I could finally hear the quiet whispers of my own heart. I started to reconnect with the things that made me feel alive, the things that had been pushed to the side for so long in my quest to please others. I remembered what it felt like to take joy in small, simple moments. The warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of laughter, the feeling of contentment that came from doing something just for me. But more than that, I began to rediscover my own worth. For so long, I had measured my value based on how much I could give, how much I could do for others. But now, with the distance and perspective that time had granted me, I began to see that my worth was not tied to anyone else's approval. It wasn't dependent on how much I could offer or how selflessly I could act. My worth was inherent, a quiet, steady presence that existed within me, regardless of how much or how little I gave to others. It was a powerful realization, one that filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I no longer needed to prove my value through acts of kindness that drained me. I no longer needed to sacrifice myself on the altar of someone else's happiness. I could still be kind, still be compassionate, but now I could do so with a sense of balance, with an understanding that my kindness didn't have to come at the cost of my own well-being. I started to practice this new form of kindness. Kindness with boundaries. Kindness that included myself in the equation. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the old patterns of overgiving and overextending tried to creep back in. Moments when I felt the familiar pull to be everything for everyone. But each time, I reminded myself of the lesson I had learned. I reminded myself that I deserved the same care and compassion that I so freely gave to others. As time passed, I became more confident in my ability to set those boundaries. I learned how to say no without guilt, how to give without losing myself in the process. I found that by protecting my own energy, by taking care of myself first, I was actually able to give more authentically, more fully, when I chose to. I could be kind from a place of abundance, rather than from a place of depletion. And in this new space, I found myself surrounded by people who understood the value of mutual respect, of reciprocity. These were people who didn't just take, they gave as well. They saw me, truly saw me, not as a source of endless support, but as a person with needs, desires, and boundaries of my own. They appreciated my kindness, but they didn't demand it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt what it was like to be in relationships that were balanced, that were rooted in mutual care and respect. Looking back on the journey I had taken, I realized how much I had grown. I was no longer the person who believed that kindness meant giving everything away. I was no longer the person who equated love with self-sacrifice. I had learned that true kindness, the kind that heals rather than harms, begins with oneself. It begins with the understanding that we are all deserving of the same compassion we offer to others. In the end, Walking away wasn't just an act of leaving. It was an act of coming home to myself. It was a journey of rediscovery, of reclaiming the parts of me that had been lost in the endless cycle of giving without receiving. And though the path was painful at times, it was a necessary pain, one that led me to a deeper, more profound understanding of what it truly means to be kind.